Welcome everybody to the Presbyterian Heritage Center here in Montreat, North Carolina. We are here right at the threshold of the C.S. Lewis exhibit, which has been up for almost the past year, put in partly in conjunction with a wonderful C.S. Lewis conference that took place here in early November of 2019. And for this time of considering C.S. Lewis and hymns, we thought it would be appropriate to be right here at the threshold and also within the wardrobe. When I was a kid, my grandmother gave our family a paperback copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I don't know where that copy has gone, but my experience with that book was probably like many of your experiences with that book, or any book which has some magical, captivating power that first reading becomes a threshold in which we pass into enchanted places and wondrous ideas. And we keep passing that threshold with every rereading or with reading subsequent books by an author or in a series or in a genre. And certainly these Narnia books, and really many books by C.S. Lewis, have been a continuous threshold crossing for me and probably for many of you. So we thought for this consideration of C.S. Lewis and hymns that we would actually cross this threshold. So we're going to go into the wardrobe, where we will have some conversation about this great author and hymns. And this is not so much a conversation about what hymns C.S. Lewis might or might not have liked or known, as what the conversation might be between his works and his thought and our practices of singing hymns, and even the hymns that we know. Here we are in Narnia, you might say, with trees and snow and the lamppost, and over here, first editions of the Narnia books, and we'll hear some excerpts from two of those stories and from other works by C.S. Lewis as we go through. I said earlier I don't have an original copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. My original copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I do have my original one of Prince Caspian, which is mostly loose pages and faded Scotch tape at this point. I am a lover and a quoter of C.S. Lewis, not just Narnia, but the Space Trilogy and the works of Christian apologetics and An Experiment in Criticism. Leonard Bernstein spoke about composing once in an interview, and he said that he supposed, like all composers, he was always writing the same piece. In a certain sense, we might think that C.S. Lewis was always writing the same book, or the same kind of books, or rehearsing the same ideas and themes. So there are books of C.S. Lewis that I haven't read, and I hope to get to them at some point and find that they are both a wonderful surprise, and also that they contain resonances and echoes of the things of Lewis that I've already read. I'm also not in any remote sense a scholar of C.S. Lewis. I just happen to know some of the books. Lewis said in his book, in the introduction to his book, Reflections on the Psalms, from which we'll hear more later, in the introduction, Lewis wrote this: "I write as one amateur to another, talking about difficulties I have met or lights I have gained, with the hope that this might at any rate interest and sometimes even help other inexpert readers. I am comparing notes, not presuming to instruct." So for this time together, I am interested in the same kind of thing, comparing notes. Not so much comparing my notes with yours as all of our notes with the world of the church's worship and music. C.S. Lewis had, of course, a supreme gift of apologetics, of encapsulating theology, of making theology clear, vivid, and memorable by means of image and analogy, by sequential progression, by storytelling it, by locating theology in the here and now of human experience. Hymns in the church do all of these things as well, though we don't usually think of hymns as apologetics. So we can compare notes with what Lewis, the poet and apologist, said about hymns. And I also think it is interesting for us to eavesdrop as Lewis compares notes with himself, we might say, to see what he says about church music, but also how music, more broadly imagined, appears in some of his works. Probably my favorite book of C.S. Lewis's is the third Narnia chronicle, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And that book, the story of that book is a sailing journey from Narnia in which the characters are seeking lost Narnian lords and perhaps the end of the world. Near the end of the book, the travelers pause on a mysterious island. Coming ashore in the dark hours before dawn, they see a table set with a feast, where 3 of the lost lords are asleep. In the gray pre-dawn, they take their places at the table, and we read, "It was about 10 by now and almost dark. Those strange new constellations burned in the east. They wrapped themselves in their sea cloaks and sat still and waited. All the time they heard the waves breaking on the beach. After hours that seemed like ages, there came a moment when they all knew they had been dozing a moment before, but were all suddenly wide awake. The stars were all in quite different positions from those they had last noticed. Before them, beyond the pillars, there was the slope of a low hill. A door opened in the hillside, light appeared in the doorway, and a figure came out, and the door shut behind it. It was a tall girl, carrying a silver candlestick, which she now set upon the table. The stars had grown fainter. Great gaps of white light were appearing in the grayness of the eastern sky. Slowly the door opened again, and out there came a figure as tall and straight as the girl's, but not so slender. It carried no light, but light seemed to come from it. As it came nearer, Lucy saw that it was like an old man. The old man came on without speaking to the travelers and stood on the other side of the table opposite to his daughter. Then both of them held up their arms before them and turned to face the east. In that position, they began to sing. Lucy said afterwards that it was high, almost shrill, but very beautiful, a cold kind of song, an early morning kind of song. And as they sang, the gray clouds lifted from the eastern sky, and the white patches grew bigger and bigger till it was all white, and the sea began to shine like silver. The sun came up out of the sea, and the brightness of its ray on the dew and on the table was far beyond any morning brightness they had ever seen. Then something seemed to be flying at them out of the very center of the rising sun. Presently the air became full of voices, voices which took up the same song that the lady and her father were singing, but in far wilder tones and in a language which no one knew. And after that, the owners of these voices could be seen. They were birds, large and white, and they came by hundreds and thousands and alighted on everything. Lucy saw one bird fly to the old man with something in its beak that looked like a little fruit, which it might have been, for it was too bright to look at. And the bird laid it in the old man's mouth. Then the birds stopped their singing and appeared to be very busy about the table. When they rose from it again, everything on the table that could be eaten or drunk had disappeared. These birds rose from their meal in their thousands and hundreds and took their flight back to the rising sun. Now at last the old man turned to the travelers and bade them welcome. "I am Ramandu. I am a star at rest. The days when I was a star had ceased long before any of you knew this world, that all the constellations have changed. When I set for the last time, decrepit and old beyond all that you can reckon, I was carried to this island. I am not so old now as I was then. Every morning a bird brings me a fireberry from the valleys in the sun, and each fireberry takes away a little of my age. And when I have become as young as the child that was born yesterday, then I shall take my rising again and once more tread the great dance." A beautiful passage, and so it may seem odd to us that the author who could write that passage could also say about music in church the following: "Hymns were and are extremely disagreeable to me." Or, "Of all musical instruments I liked and like the organ least." Or, "I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music." These are incomplete quotes, which we will finish later, but for the moment, here's another. Are the people edified by being allowed to shout their favorite hymns? I have often heard this noise. I have sometimes contributed to it. I do not yet seem to have found any evidence that the physical and emotional exhilaration which it produces is necessarily, or often, of any religious relevance. What I, like many other laymen, chiefly desire in church are fewer, better, and shorter hymns, especially fewer. This quote comes from one of C.S. Lewis's short essays called, simply enough, On Church Music, and found in his book, Christian Reflections. Eric Routley, hymnologist of the 20th century, called this an ill-tempered essay, and in many ways it is. The Lewis in this essay does not love hymns or hymn singing with particular zeal. He always calls hymn singing shouting. But as usual, he directs us to deep and fundamental questions from that clarity he possessed, which is so often inexorable and irresistible. In this essay, after confirming in the first sentence that he has no musical education, he makes this basic assumption, quote, I assume from the outset that nothing should be done or sung or said in church which does not aim directly or indirectly either at glorifying God or edifying the people or both. A good service may of course have a cultural value as well, but that is not what it exists for, just as in an unfamiliar landscape, a church may help me to find the points of the compass, but was not built for that purpose. It's a classic kind of Lewis analogy, very clear, helping to make his point. Lewis here does not view church music through any kind of soft focus lens or rose-colored glasses. He says neither the greatest excellence of a trained performance from the choir, nor the heartiest and most enthusiastic bellowing from the pews must be taken to signify that any specifically religious activity is going on. It may be, or it may not. In this essay, Lewis is asking not only how church music may or may not glorify God, but how it may or may not edify other people. We know these questions ourselves. They are the questions of taste, of excellence, of popularity, of kindness. Lewis says that problems in church music are never merely musical. Let's listen again. There are two musical situations on which I think we can be confident that a blessing rests. One is where a priest or an organist, a person of trained and delicate taste, humbly and charitably sacrifices his own aesthetically right desires and gives the people humbler and coarser fare than he would wish, in a belief, even as it may be the erroneous belief, that he can thus bring them to God. The other is where the stupid and unmusical layman, humbly and patiently, and above all silently, listens to music which he cannot or cannot fully appreciate, in the belief that it somehow glorifies God, and that if it does not edify him, this must be his own defect. Neither such a highbrow nor such a lowbrow can be far out of the way. To both, church music will have been a means of grace, not the music they have liked, but the music they have disliked. They have both offered, sacrificed their taste in the fullest sense. But where the opposite situation arises, where the musician is filled with the pride of skill or the virus of emulation and looks with contempt on the unappreciative congregation, or where the unmusical, complacently entrenched in their own ignorance and conservatism, look with the restless and resentful hostility of an inferiority complex on all who would try to improve their taste, there, we may be sure, all that both offer is unblessed, and the spirit that moves them is not the Holy Ghost. These highly general reflections will not, I fear, be of much practical use to any priest or organist in devising a working compromise for a particular church. The most they can hope to do is suggest that the problem is never a merely musical one. Where both the choir and the congregation are spiritually on the right road, no insurmountable difficulties will occur. Discrepancies of taste and capacity will indeed provide matter for mutual charity and humility. What do we hear from C.S. Lewis about the Bible's own hymn book? He reflected on Psalms in a book called Reflections on the Psalms, and this book gives us some insight to how he thought about the poems and the implicit music in the Psalms. Here he writes, "What must be said is that the Psalms are poems, and poems intended to be sung. There is a sense in which the Bible, since it is after all literature, cannot properly be read except as literature, and the different parts of it, as the different sorts of literature they are. Most emphatically, the Psalms must be read as poems, as lyrics, with all the licenses and all the formalities, the hyperboles, the emotional rather than logical connections which are proper to lyric poetry. They must be read as poems if they are to be understood. Otherwise, we shall miss what is in them and think we see what is not. This shouldn't surprise us because we know that Lewis was a poet. We know that being a great poet was a goal and a hope, particularly in the early part of his life and career. Lewis's whole alertness to poetry, his ability to reside in a poetic world, is where his consideration of the Psalms begins. Again, we hear him. It seems to me appropriate, almost inevitable, that when the great imagination, which in the beginning had invented and formed the whole world of nature, submitted to express itself in human speech, that speech should sometimes be poetry. For poetry is a little incarnation, giving body to what had been before invisible and inaudible. In this book, Reflections on the Psalms, Lewis explores what we already know, the extraordinary range of the Psalms. At its best, this book echoes mere Christianity, asking relentlessly and in various ways, who is God, and therefore, who are we in relation to God? It is the question our Presbyterian worship always asks at the beginning, naming who God is and what God does, so that we can recognize and confess our humanity, that we are not God. Among other ideas, Lewis in this book explores judgment, anger, emotional range and robustness, praise and creation, all as one with life. In the Psalms, says Lewis, judgment is the good news of God's justice. He says that quote, we need not therefore be surprised if the Psalms and the prophets are full of the longing for judgment and regard the announcement that judgment is coming as good news. Hundreds and thousands of people who have been stripped of all they possess and who have the right entirely on their side will at last be heard. Of course they are not afraid of judgment. They know their case is unanswerable if only it can be heard. When God comes to judge, at last it will. This longing for judgment and justice, says Lewis, should include anger. The absence of anger, especially that sort of anger which we call indignation, can, in my opinion, be a most alarming symptom. The Psalms curse more bitterly, at least in part, because they took right and wrong more seriously. For if we look at their railings, we find that they are usually angry not simply because these things have been done to them, but because these things are manifestly wrong, are hateful to God as well as to the victim. The thought of the righteous Lord, who surely must hate such doings as much as they do, who surely, therefore, must, but how terribly he delays, judge or avenge, is always there, if only in the background. Lewis is talking of psalms, but we can naturally think of the church's hymnody, and especially of protest songs and songs that give us words for leaning into God's justice, both inside and outside the church. And our own Glory to God hymnal, I think of these phrases from hymns. That's a hymn called El Pobre Nada Tiene, when the poor ones, the title of the hymn is Cuando el Pobre, when the poor ones who have nothing. Poignant hymn. Or another hymn that comes to us from Brazil, lend an ear to the rising cry for help from oppressed and hopeless people. Or hymn which is very popular here in Montreat at our youth conferences, at our Sunday night hymn sings, for everyone born, a place at the table. Or a dramatic hymn by John Bell from the Iona community. Heaven shall not wait for the poor to lose their patience. Or a poignant hymn, How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord, will you forget an answer to my prayer? Or of course, the anthem that we know so well, and in these days, just after John Lewis's death, is even more on our minds, We Shall Overcome. All these songs express a sense of justice in the Psalms that Lewis finds. Lewis also perceives in liturgy and hymns sometimes a dutiful dullness that contrasts with the Psalms and the Bible's whole expressive range, not just in despairing moments, but in exuberant ones too. He says, there is a fierceness mixed with the sweetness in the Magnificat to which most painted Madonnas do little justice. I am sure that the private life of the Holy Family was, in many senses, mild and gentle, but perhaps hardly in the way some hymn writers have in mind. Or, the most valuable thing the Psalms do for me is to express that same delight in God which made David dance. I am comparing it with the merely dutiful church-going and laborious saying our prayers, to which most of us are, thank God, not always, but often reduced. When Lewis says that Psalms are intended to be sung, he seems to mean this robustness that is inherently songful, not poetic texts which are then applied to music or have music applied to them. They are glad and rejoice. Their fingers itch for the harp, for the lute and harp. Wake up, lute and harp. Let's have a song. Bring the tambourine. Bring the merry harp with lute. We're going to sing merrily and make a cheerful noise. Noise, you may well say. Mere music is not enough. Let everyone clap their hands. Let us have clashing cymbals, not only well-tuned, but loud, and dances too. Let even the remote islands share the exultation. He says in church often, we have a terrible concern about good taste, yet even we can still exult. In chapter 9 of Reflections on the Psalms, he gives us this wonderful phrase, praise almost seems to be inner health made audible. I think he is pointing us to a wholeness, not just in the psalm texts themselves, but in the spiritual sense of life to which they bear witness, in which praise, community, enjoyment of song, memory, and prayer are all one thing, clear-eyed about injustice and thanksgiving alike. So it's time for a hymn. What would Lewis have thought in Glory to God of hymn 341? He might have known this as a textual paraphrase, a metrical psalm, so called because it is said in poetic meter, a setting of Psalm 67, O God, show mercy to us. It's virtually certain that he knew this melody by British composer Gustav Holst, taken from Holst's orchestral suite, The Planets. This tune is the center of the movement called Jupiter. I confess I have not always cared for this melody as a hymn tune. It's such a magnificent orchestral melody that most words can't, it seems to me, do it justice. But here, the words do it justice because they come from the Psalms and have the necessary weight that Lewis was talking about. Would Lewis have found this text and tune a good match? We don't know. But let's think about it as we see and as we hear and sing. O God, show mercy to us and bless us with your grace, and cause to shine upon us the brightness of your face, so that your way most holy on earth may soon be known, and unto every people your saving grace be shown. Let all the peoples praise you, let all the nations sing, and in every land let praises and songs of gladness ring. For you will judge the peoples in truth and righteousness, and on the earth all nations will your just rule confess. Let all the peoples praise you, let all the nations sing. Then earth in rich abundance to us its fruit will bring. The Lord our God will bless us, our God will blessings send, and all the earth will worship to its remotest end. That tune, as we have said, comes from Holst's work, The Planets, the movement called Jupiter. C.S. Lewis wrote an alliterative poem called The Planets. Here is part of what he writes, evoking Jupiter. We leave all things to reach the rim of the round welkin, heaven's hermitage, mild and meadow as we mount further, where rippled radiance rolls about us, moved with music, measureless the waves, joy and jubilee. It is Jove's orbit, filled and festal, faster turning with arc ampler. All that alliteration is really musical for somebody who said he didn't love hymns. In the third volume of Lewis's space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, mythologies overlap as ancient gods descend to earth. Jupiter's appearance right in the middle of the kitchen is dramatic and musical. Before the other angels a man might sink, before this he might die, but if he lived at all, he would laugh. Kingship and power and festal pomp and courtesy shot from him as sparks fly from an anvil. The pealing of bells, the blowing of trumpets, the spreading out of banners are means used on earth to make a faint symbol of his quality. The kettle put on, the hot toddy brewed, the musician bidden to get out his fiddle, chairs pushed back, floor cleared, some round dance, no modern shuffling, beating the floor, clapping of hands, leaping high. Lewis is unafraid in his works to let different mythologies be in conversation. It's one of the things I've appreciated so much about what he writes. He's unafraid to let mythology compare notes, to use his word. In Reflections on the Psalms, he makes a pointed detour away from the Psalms to discuss the famous hymn to the sun attributed to the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who tried to establish monotheism in 14th century BC Egypt. The sun for Akhenaten was not God, but a manifestation. And Lewis spends 4 pages in the middle of a book on the Psalms musing on what he calls this Pharaoh's theological leap and what this ancient hymn can teach to those of us of biblical faith. Interestingly, Akhenaten is an opera, an American opera by Philip Glass, which was just staged this past fall, the fall of 2019, by the Metropolitan Opera. If you are interested in it, you might go to their website and see if it's available at Met Opera On Demand. That hymn to the sun is the central moment of the opera, the end of Act 2, and it's 10 of the most amazing minutes of music in an opera dramatic moment that you can imagine. All of this language of laughter and of the sun may have led you, if you know Lewis's works, to think of what is probably the most dramatic and wondrous musical evocation in Lewis's work, his account in the 6th Narnia book of creation. This is the book called The Magician's Nephew, and in it, a creation story unfolds in song. I'll read to you from my original childhood copy, of which only the back cover is falling off. As I say, in this book, a creation story unfolds in song. 2 children, Diggory and Polly, early in the book stumble into the private study of Diggory's Uncle Andrew, whose experiments in magic force them into travels to other worlds. They journey first to a dying world called Charn, where they meet the malevolent witch queen Jadis, hungry for a new world to rule. Fearing that it will be this world, the children attempt with magic to bring her somewhere else. That attempt lands them, the 2 children, the witch, the uncle, and the accidental addition of a cab driver and a horse, in a land completely dark, with some kind of ground under their feet. They don't know where they are, or even if they are. We then read this scene. Now then, came the cabbie's voice. a good, firm, hearty voice. Keep cool, everyone. That's what I say. No bones broken, anyone? Good. If you ask me, I think the best thing we could do to pass the time would be to sing a hymn. And he did. He struck up at once a harvest thanksgiving hymn, all about crops being safely gathered in. Here you see a copy from a hymn book published in the mid-1800s called Hymns Ancient and Modern, which Lewis may well have known. And of course, when we hear that quote in the middle of The Magician's Nephew, the hymn quote about crops being safely gathered in, we might naturally think of the hymn, this hymn, Come Ye Thankful People Come. That robustness, of course, is what we get with keyboard harmony, but imagine it in this context of this story. One person's voice in a completely dark place, not knowing what is before them. This scene is not only dramatic in itself, in the drama of the story, it sets the stage for what comes next in this darkness. And we pick up the story. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes they almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words, there was hardly even a tune, but it was beyond comparison the most beautiful noise they had ever heard. Two wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as they do on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness. Next moment, 1,000 points of light leaped out. Single stars, constellations, and planets, brighter and bigger than any in our world. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you had seen and heard it, you would have felt quite certain that it was the stars themselves who were singing, and that it was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. Far away and down the horizon, the sky began to turn gray. A light wind, very fresh, began to stir. The sky in that one place grew slowly and steadily paler. You could see the shapes of hills standing up dark against it. All the time, the voice went on singing. The eastern sky changed from white to pink and from pink to gold. The voice rose and rose till all the air was shaking with it. And just as it swelled to the mightiest and most glorious sound it had yet produced, the sun arose. You could imagine that it laughed for joy as it came up. And as its beams shot across the land, the travelers could see for the first time what sort of place they were in. It was a valley through which a broad, swift river wound its way, flowing eastward towards the sun. Southward there were mountains, northward there were lower hills. It was a valley of mere earth, rock and water. There was not a tree, not a bush, not a blade of grass to be seen. The earth was of many colors. They were fresh, hot, and vivid. They made you feel excited until you saw the singer himself, and then you forgot everything else. It was a lion, huge, shaggy, and bright. It stood facing the risen sun. Its mouth was wide open in song, and it was about 300 yards away. The song had now changed. The lion was pacing to and fro about that empty land and singing his new song. It was softer and more lilting than the song by which he had called up the stars and the sun, a gentle, rippling music. And as he walked and sang, the valley grew green with grass. It spread out from the lion like a pool. It ran up the sides of the little hills like a wave. In a few minutes, it was creeping up the lower slopes of the distant mountains, making that young world every moment softer. The light wind could now be heard ruffling the grass. The lion was singing still, but now the song had once more changed. It was more like what we should call a tune, but it was also far wilder. Can you imagine a stretch of grassy land bubbling like water in a pot? For that is really the best description of what was happening. In all directions it was swelling into humps, and the humps moved and swelled till they burst, and the crumbled earth poured out of them, and from each hump there came out an animal. You could hardly hear the song of the lion. There was so much cawing, cooing, crowing, braying, neighing, baying, barking, lowing, bleating, and trumpeting. The lion opened his mouth, but no sound came from it. He was breathing out a long, warm breath. It seemed to sway all the beasts as the wind sways a line of trees. Far overhead, from beyond the veil of blue sky which hid them, the stars sang again, a pure, cold, difficult music. Then there came a swift flash like fire, but it burnt nobody, either from the sky or from the lion itself, and every drop of blood tingled in their bodies, and the deepest, wildest voice they had ever heard was saying, "Narnia, Narnia, Narnia, awake, love, think, speak, be walking trees, be talking beasts, be divine waters." What an extraordinary scene, and all the more remarkable for being written by a person whose feelings about music and worship seem so ambivalent. What the scene is really about, of course, is poetry, poetry with a capital P. Creation here is, in a sense, verbalized, like Genesis, voiced into being. The Lion's Song has no words, but it has character. It has rise and fall, it has specificity, a wordless song that brings to life nameable things. We might hear in this Lewis's favorite psalm, Psalm 19, the hymn to creation and to the law, where verses 3 and 4 might well be the Lion's Song. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In Reflections on the Psalms, Lewis discusses Psalm 19, for him the pinnacle of all psalms. He says, "I take this Psalm 19 to be the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. Most readers will remember its structure, 6 verses about nature, 5 about the law, and 4 of personal prayer. First, the poet thinks of the sky, the splendor of its creator. Then he thinks of the sun, the unimaginable speed of its daily voyage from east to west. Finally, of its heat, the cloudless, blinding, tyrannous rays hammering on the hills, searching every cranny. The key phrase on which the whole poem depends is, 'There is nothing hid from the heat thereof.' It pierces everywhere with its strong, clean ardor." Then at once, in verse 7, he is talking of something else, which hardly seems to him something else, because it is so like the all-piercing, all-detecting sunshine. The law is undefiled. The law gives light. It is clean and everlasting. It is sweet, luminous, severe, disinfectant, exultant. This poet is wholly free from self-righteousness, and the last section is concerned with his secret faults. As he has felt the sun searching him out in every nook of shade where he attempted to hide from it, so he feels the law searching out all the hiding places of his soul. Psalm 19 ends with these words we all know so well. "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." I have wondered if there is a poignant echo of Lewis's favorite psalm and of the lion's wordless song later in this book, The Magician's Nephew. Towards the end of the story, the children are sent on an errand to bring Aslan, the lion, an apple from a tree in a faraway garden. The apple is to be for the protection of Narnia. Tempted by the witch queen to keep the apple for himself and to heal his mother's deathly illness back home, Diggory resists and brings the apple to Aslan. The apple is planted and quickly grows into an apple tree. And Aslan tells Diggory to take an apple for his mother. It is one of the smallest, most moving moments in all the Narnia stories. Diggory could say nothing, for tears choked him, and he gave up all hopes of saving his mother's life. But at the same time, he knew that the lion knew what would have happened, and that there might be things more terrible even than losing someone you love by death. But now Aslan was speaking again. That is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple. It is not what will happen now. What I give you now will bring joy. It will not in your world give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree. For a second, Diggory could hardly understand. It was as if the whole world had turned inside out and upside down. And then, like someone in a dream, he was walking across to the tree, and the king and queen were cheering him, and all the creatures were cheering too. He plucked the apple and put it in his pocket. Then he came back to Aslan. Please, he said, may we go home now? He had forgotten to say thank you, but he meant it, and Aslan understood. Lewis, the poet, loved Psalm 19 so much that it's unlikely any hymn version would be in his sight acceptable. Nonetheless, we'll hear and sing one, and we can wonder what Lewis might have thought. This in Glory to God is hymn 690, God's Glory Fills the Heavens. It is a textual paraphrase of Psalm 19 written by Carl P. Daw, Jr. And it is an Irish tune that Lewis the Irishman might well have known, called St. Patrick because it's often sung to a textual version of the prayer of St. Patrick. The three stanzas in Carl Daw's paraphrase follow the three sections that Lewis talks about in the psalm: nature, law, and personal prayer. As we hear and sing, let's imagine what Lewis might have thought. We'll do our comparing of notes. God's glory fills the heavens with hymns, the domed sky bears the Maker's mark, new praises sound from day to day, and echo through the knowing dark. Without a word their songs roll on, into all lands their voices run, and with a champion's strength and grace from farthest hem comes forth the sun. God's perfect law revives the soul, its precepts make the simple wise, its just commands rejoice the heart, its truth gives light unto the eyes. Forever shall this song endure, unblemished, righteous, true, complete. No gold was ever found so fine, no honey in the comb more sweet. God's servant may I ever be, this world my joy, that word my guide. Oh, cleanse me, Lord, from secret sin, deliver me from selfish pride. Accept my thoughts and words and deeds, let them C.S. Lewis's few writings about hymns and church music specifically are not, as we have heard, encouraging. He seems to see music in church as too often ponderous, loud, coarse, and long-winded. Hymnologist Eric Routley also suspected that Lewis might fear in church music, as in life, the threat of the inner ring, the clique, the prideful and unneighborly temptation of a closed group. I wonder if it is partly also a matter of poetry, not just the poetry of hymn texts, but again, poetry, capital P. For Lewis, poet himself, the worlds of poetry, story, and imagination were not closed worlds of doctrine, but living worlds of revelation. Further up and further in is a phrase from the final Narnia book as the story moves into more and more transparent places. For Lewis, poetry and imaginative stories, whether in the Bible, from other mythologies, or from the world of literature, were vehicles through which glimpses of other things were possible. In one of his greatest sermons, The Weight of Glory, he writes of this transparency as the longing for a place we glimpse but have never been. He writes, "In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence. The secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when, in very intimate conversation, the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves. The secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Our commonest expedient is to call it beauty and behave as if that had settled the matter. Wordsworth's expedient was to identify it with certain moments in his own past, but this is all a cheat. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. What he remembered would turn out to be itself a remembering. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." In Glory to God, hymn 850, called In a Deep, Unbounded Darkness, a translation by Mary Louise Bringle of an anonymous text of Chinese origin. I should say it's Mary Louise Bringle's adaptation of a translation by Francis P. Jones, and a tune which Lewis certainly would have known. We sing it during Advent and Christmas, the ancient hymn Corde natus ex parentis, of a parent's heart begotten. Mary Louise Bringle, of course, is our friend just down the road at Brevard College, and herself a formidable C.S. Lewis scholar. I think Lewis would have resonated to the words in this hymn. Creation, the constantness of God, our boasting only in Jesus, and the last stanzas beckoning homeward, just as he alludes in The Weight of Glory. In a deep, unbounded darkness. In a deep, unbounded darkness, long before the first light shone, you, O God, beyond all merit, worked a wonder faith makes known. In your mercy, you embraced
us as your own, evermore and evermore. Though our world is ever changing, you are constant, firm, and sure, faithful to your covenant promise. Trusting you, we live secure, singing praises, long as heart and breath endure, evermore and evermore. Joy transforms our lips to boasting, only in your matchless grace, sending Christ to dwell among us, Word made flesh in time and space, friend and Savior, in whose life we glimpse your face, evermore and evermore. God of Hagar, God of Sarah, God of nomad Abraham, God of Miriam, God of Moses, fiery pillar, great I am. Lead us homeward, to the love feast of the Lamb, evermore and evermore.
Again, from The Weight of Glory, Lewis writes of what he calls the other sense of glory, glory as brightness, splendor, luminosity. We are to shine as the sun. We are to be given the morning star. I think I begin to see what this means. In one way, of course, God has given us the morning star already. You can go and enjoy the gift on many fine mornings if you get up early enough. What more, you may ask, do we want? But we want so much more, something the books on aesthetics take little notice of. But the poets and the mythologies know all about it. We do not merely want to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see, but all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. Meanwhile, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is a Monday morning. A cleft is opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our great captain inside. It may be asked what practical use there is in the speculations which I have been indulging. I can think of at least one such use. It may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. In a similar vein, I think, he writes this towards the end of his essay on church music. What is looked for in us is another kind of glorifying, which depends on intention. How easy or how hard it may be for a whole choir to preserve that intention through all the discussions and decisions, all the corrections and disappointments, all the temptations to pride, rivalry, and ambition which precede the performance of a great work, I naturally do not know. But it is on the intention that all depends. When it succeeds, I think the performers are the most enviable of people, privileged while mortals to honor God like angels, and for a few golden moments to see spirit and flesh, delight and labor, skill and worship, the natural and the supernatural, all fused into that unity they would have had before the fall. But I must insist that no degree of excellence in the music, simply as music, can assure us that this paradisal state has been achieved. The excellence proves keenness, but people can be keen for natural or even wicked motives. The absence of keenness would prove that they lacked the right spirit. Its presence does not prove that they have it. Remember the quote from earlier. Lewis said, "I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music." That isn't the whole quote. Let's finish it. "I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music, but as I went on, I saw the great merit of it. I came up against different people of quite different outlooks and different education, and then gradually my conceit just began peeling off. I realized that the hymns, which were just sixth-rate music, were nevertheless being sung with devotion and benefit by an old saint in elastic-side boots in the opposite pew. And then you realize that you aren't fit to clean those boots. It gets you out of your solitary conceit. It is not for me to lay down laws, as I am only a layman, and I don't know much." Or as Lewis says very simply in Letters to Malcolm, "I think our business is to take what we are given and make the best of it." That phrase could apply really to every Narnia story. All through them, the characters are taking what they are given and making the best of it. I think we could even rewrite Lewis and have it make equal sense. We might say, "I think our business is to take what we are given and find poetry in it." Lewis, the poet, found poetry everywhere and made poetry everywhere. His stories, really all his writings, invite readers to locate their imagination, to notice poetry. Lewis seemed to find poetry in neighborliness as much as in art. Surprised by Joy was his autobiography and, I think, his way of being in the world. He must have known this last hymn, "Will Do," by one of England's most famous hymn writers, William Cowper. Sometimes a light surprises. He probably knew this British folk tune as well. What more Lewis-like phrase could there be than the title of this hymn, "Sometimes a Light Surprises"?
Sometimes a light surprises the child of God who sings. It is the Lord who rises with healing in his wings. When comforts are declining, he grants the soul again a season of clear shining to cheer it after rain. In holy contemplation we sweetly then pursue the theme of God's salvation and find it ever new. Set free from present sorrow, we cheerfully can say that the unknown tomorrow bring with it what it may. It can bring with it nothing, but He will bear us through, who gives the lilies' clothing will clothe his people too. Beneath the spreading heavens, no creature is but fed, and he who feeds the ravens will give his children bread. Though vine nor fig tree neither their longed for fruit should bear, though all the field should wither, nor flocks nor herds be there, yet God the same abiding, his praise shall tune my